Hic sunt dracones was a phrase that medieval cartographers would write on the blank areas of their maps. It was an acknowledgement of the limits of what they knew. They would place it over spaces that were unexplored, literally unknown. It said, we know there's something here, but we have no idea what. Maybe this is where the dragons are. There's no place for dragons in modern cartography. There are no blank spaces on the maps. Technology brings us a sense that everywhere in the world is mapped. Smartphones and GPS systems reassure us that we always know where we are. In my work, I'm really interested in those things that exist in the world, but that we never see, and the difference between knowing about them, seeing them in pictures, and experiencing them in real life. Often I refer to what I do as reenactments, because they reproduce the object that they're interested in, but in a way that makes it clear that the object is not actually present in the space. It's not a trick. It's an attempt to capture the physical presence of the object as well as its kind of symbolic overtones. This exhibition brings together a whole series of works that look at the way that the world is mapped, explored, examined, described. The works exist in a space somewhere between sculpture and architecture. They play with scale, jumping in between an actual sized reenactment of the object under examination and a more ambiguously scaled narrative space. In this exhibition, I was interested in looking at the technology, but also the symbolism and significance of the GPS or satellite navigation systems that increasingly define modern cartography. And in looking at them, I became aware that there are actually quite a number of these satellite navigation systems up there in space. The famous one, GPS, was put up by the Americans in the 80s. The Russians put up a system called GLONASS, which fell into disrepair but has recently been revamped. And the Europeans are in the process of installing a network of satellites called Galileo. The Chinese have one that only functions over mainland China. And India is also in the process of setting up their own satellite navigation system. It's interesting to me that there are these essentially redundant but highly resource intensive technologies that countries feel they have to put up into space. And it reminded me of the fact that there's always been a deep and important connection between cartography and empires. In fact, the power of an empire was often predicated on its ability to map the country that it controlled. It seems to me that there's an important symbolic value to the countries involved in being able to put a GPS system up into space. That relationship between cartography and geopolitics, I think, is an interesting one to explore. But also the fact that these GPS systems are so ubiquitous yet so invisible. We don't really know what they look like. So I set out to explore the objects that underlie the technologies. And so to that end, in this exhibition, I've reenacted 4 of the key GPS satellite systems in a variety of different ways. The EU's Galileo satellite is a wall work constructed from waxed plywood that focuses on the repetitive abstraction of its 72 circular antennas. Russia's new GLONASS satellite is also wall hung, but it is constructed from glossy white aluminium panel. It is somewhere between an altarpiece and a constructivist mask. The USA's Navstar GPS satellite takes this architectural connection even further, with the plywood piece presented on a tabletop. The various antennas and receptors become towers and buildings, and in the space in between these, we see small white figures interacting with each other in their environment. These figures are found in a number of works in the show and do a couple of things. They perform a switch on the scale of the objects, transforming them from actual size to miniature and back. They also add a layer of narrative to the works, converting them from mechanistic objects into spaces. Standing near the GPS satellite city is another object that appears to be a scale model of some sort of observation tower. Within its walls and platform we again see the little figures, this time primarily watching, looking across at the other works perhaps. This strange tower is actually a one-to-one plywood reenactment of the Google Street View camera apparatus that is used to capture the photos of places that Google serves up to us as part of its mapping service. This provides an apposite, privatised and corporate mirror to the massive governmental undertakings that the GPS satellites represent. It reminds us of the way that much as the great world empires have succeeded, other giant corporate empires are rising, and they too define their ubiquity through mapping. Sitting amongst these larger works are a pair of smaller objects. On first glance, they also appear like small architectural models, perhaps of classical temples. These objects are actually the two components of what's known as a black box flight recorder: the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. As I was working on the show, these objects were very much in the news, at the centre of the search for the crash site of the Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 that had disappeared so tragically and mysteriously. What struck me at the time was just how much energy and emotion were invested in these two objects. We were shocked and outraged by the loss of this aircraft, and particularly distressed by the mystery of it. Here we are in this world, surrounded by technology, by our satellite navigation systems, yet we managed to lose something as enormous as a plane. These small objects, to me, are a reminder that the sense of omniscience that these technologies give us is actually quite illusory. This is something that I come up against often when I'm researching my objects. I will search for images of the Galileo GPS satellite and I'll get thousands and thousands of pictures back. As I look at them more closely, I'll realise that they're actually not pictures of the same thing. Perhaps they're pictures of the one object that's changed over time. The closer you get, the fuzzier the objects become. The black box flight recorders remind us of just how unacceptable the possibility that we might not know something is in this day and age. There are two works titled A Maquette for a Monument to Unknown Space No. 1 and No. 2. These are two small-scale models of objects that remind us of the unexplored spaces in the world. One of them reenacts the Alvin deep sea exploration vehicle, a sort of manned submarine that goes down to the bottom of the deepest parts of the ocean. We know so little about the depths of the ocean, yet they are so much of the world that surrounds us. They're often described as places where nothing could possibly live, and yet we go down there and discover thriving ecosystems full of extraordinary creatures. Against one wall of the gallery are a series of 4 wax and pewter sculptures. These are my attempts to reenact the smoke plumes that sit underneath the rockets that lift these GPS satellites into space. I wrote a script in the 3D modelling program that I use to generate a basic sort of DIY particle simulation of the smoke plumes that sit underneath the rockets. These sculptures sort of physicalise the extraordinary process that underlies the placement of an object into orbit. They express this sort of extraordinary force that's required to tear something from the Earth's grasp and place it into space. But they also monumentalise and memorialise a process that is incredibly insubstantial. And it's amazing to think that just this roiling plume of gas and dust that dissipates in minutes is enough to elevate a massively weighty object up into space. So the show, in essence, becomes an interplay between our desire to map the world and the impossibility of this task. When we lose something, it is still not so easy to find it. And within our cities, our experiences are not just defined by our interactions with the static fabric of the buildings, but by the shifting, unmappable flows of people who move through them.